When emotional processing and behavioral change turn at different speeds, the entire system of recovery stalls. These two gears often rotate in isolation, grinding against each other rather than driving the participant forward. One common failure occurs in programs built entirely on emotional processing. They excel at trauma de-escalation, but they often lack the rigid behavioral architecture required to translate that safety into a new way of living. Other programs attempt the opposite, enforcing strict cognitive behavioral frameworks from the start. However, participants often resist these rules because their underlying trauma remains an active, unprocessed weight. The May 12, 2026 sessions at the Reach Out Foundation Academy provide a specific case study in how to sync these two movements. The session notes capture two distinct pedagogical registers. The 9 a.m. session, led by Valerie Todd, is pastoral and somatic, focusing on the body's raw emotional responses, as seen in these hand-drawn sketches of expressive faces. This immediately shifts in the 10 a.m. session, led by Maloney. The tone becomes structural and clinical, moving from expressive doodles to a mathematical breakdown of a moral development ladder. Lasting transformation depends on this dual register approach, using somatic narrative to bypass cognitive resistance, followed by a rigorous architecture for moral reasoning. Valerie's 9 a.m. session uses a story before principle strategy. By leading with narrative, she disarms the mental defenses that usually block participants from internalizing a listen. This method targets a specific internal barrier, identified in the notes as grief aversion. Grief aversion describes the culturally conditioned suppression of honest emotions. In this environment, tears are frequently categorized as a weakness, and vulnerability is perceived as a threat to one's safety. To shift a participant's internal locus of control, Valerie uses the manufactured unhappiness parable. She describes a first-class traveler who complains about every luxury, demonstrating how internal focus can create misery regardless of external conditions. She follows this with a metaphor about a road trip with young children. By asking, "Are we there yet?" at every stop, they mistake a long journey for a series of immediate failures. This helps participants decouple human urgency from actual need. This leads to an exploration of date-anchored grief triggers. It normalizes the fact that the body can hold on to trauma that the conscious mind has not yet named, often reacting to anniversaries of loss without the participant knowing why. Valerie reframes these triggers as opportunities for gratitude. She shifts the focus from the pain of loss to an appreciation for the time actually held with those who are gone. Clearing these emotional blocks provides the necessary opening. Without this somatic reframing, participants remain too defensive to engage with a behavioral framework. Once emotional safety is established, the 10 a.m. session moves toward a structural rebuilding of the individual's identity. The facilitator uses Erikson's personality theory as a diagnostic method to identify where an individual's identity formation fractured. A central rule emerges. Any act of dishonesty or trauma forces a psychological restart. The participant falls back to the foundational stage of trust versus mistrust. For most adults, the battleground is intimacy versus isolation. The virtue needed to navigate this successfully is love. Because judgment and isolation destroy the capacity for intimacy, a safe, peer-led community functions as the primary therapeutic tool for this stage of development. Maloney bridges the gap between theory and reality by using his own history of illness and recovery. This vulnerability proves that the matrix applies to every person in the room, regardless of their background. Since deception resets all psychological progress to zero, absolute honesty serves as the load-bearing spine for the entire recovery program. From this foundation of honesty, the group uses Kohlberg's theory of moral development to plot a course toward ethical action. The rungs begin at the lowest level, pre-conventional hedonism. Here, choices are dictated purely by the instinct to seek immediate pleasure or avoid immediate pain. The ladder ascends through the conventional tiers. At these levels, participants follow rules to gain approval or simply to comply with the law. The limitation of the conventional tier is that behavior is driven by external pressure. If rules are only followed to avoid punishment, the habits vanish as soon as the supervision is removed. The objective is the post-conventional level. This is where a person acts for the benefit of the community, even when those actions carry a personal cost. The facilitator anchors this abstract goal in history, using figures like Martin Luther King Jr. to illustrate the universal impact of ethical reasoning. This framework demonstrates how higher-order values can supersede societal laws when those laws conflict with human dignity, a principle modeled by Mahatma Gandhi. Recovery is defined by this upward movement. It replaces the instinct for self-preservation with the drive to create communal value. To move from theory to daily execution, the program utilizes the 7 major treatment elements of Moral Recognition Therapy, or MRT. These notes show a specific modification. The word honest is written above every single element. This tethers every action step back to the Erikson matrix rule. The primary practical tool for the group is the $40 Catch Someone Doing Good peer incentive. This mechanism shifts the focus of behavioral conditioning. By rewarding positive reinforcement that occurs outside the facility, it trains participants to look for value in their actual lives. This strengthens the community's internal immune system. When the peer group begins to prioritize and reward health, antisocial behavior is naturally deflected. The facilitator uses the man on the roof parable to emphasize this point. A man refuses help from boats and helicopters during a flood because he believes faith alone will save him, only to drown. Even the most profound emotional insight fails to create change without a validated, actionable mechanic. The dual register approach recognizes that healing a fractured identity is the prerequisite for ethical action. The somatic work clears the path, and the structural work builds the road. This approach addresses the friction found in programs where unprocessed trauma prevents participants from adopting new, healthier habits. The facilitator's concept that gifts are for the world requires a stable identity to know which gifts are available to give. For educators, the May 12th case study shows that effective facilitation requires a fluid oscillation between these two registers. The lived experience of the facilitator provides the necessary proof for the theory. Program design must offer enough grace to handle past trauma while maintaining the absolute honesty required for current accountability. Behavioral change depends on a rigid action plan supported by a reconciled identity. At the Reach Out Foundation Academy, that synthesis is called the lived experience.